like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong, in my happy place.
So hello and welcome to our second episode of our series on healthy longevity at the Yong Lin School of Medicine at National University Singapore. We have a great speaker, Paul Irving, today, and we're going to do two slight departures from our normal strategy. We're going to have a fireside chat rather than a presentation, and although there will be no fire, hopefully. And second of all, we're going to talk about population aging rather than biology. So we're going to leave biology a little bit for this segment and talk about some of the broader issues of aging. Please, as you ask questions, use the Q&A function. And as you know, if you watched the first episode, we have reached out to citizens in Singapore to ask them what they think about aging. And today we're going to hear from Shelley Su.
Hi everyone, I'm Lavina Gunn, a Year 1 medical student. Welcome to the Healthy Longevity webinar series. Each week, we will be asking fellow Singaporeans about their take on healthy aging. This week, we have with us Ms. Shelley Su, the founder of a local social enterprise, the Singapore Shawl, as she shares with us what it means to age with grace and how she stays active by engaging in various passion projects, from landscaping and designing to supporting marginalized women in society, as well as volunteering her time to help the students at Mountbatten Vocational School. Currently, she's also championing for affordable public assisted living for the sandwiched seniors in society.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm very pleased to be sharing about living healthily. It actually includes the two Qs, I know. One is the quantity of living plus the quality of living. So we cannot live a long life without having quality. And of course, it is not putting in a lot of years in your life, but life in your years. I use the GRACE model, that is living with grace, aging with grace, and G, for a start, is always my gratitude to God. My gratitude to God for giving me what I have. So R is to not to retire, but to refire. Refire, and I'm very blessed because instead of just retiring, doing nothing, lazing around, I was able to put that into what I missed out when I was younger, much younger, and to identify myself with other women in Singapore who never had a chance to do what they really want in life. So what I did was, at the ripe old age of 60, by the way, I am 15 now, I was able to refire instead of to retire. And I was supporting marginalized women who had no opportunities to self-actualize. And I started a social enterprise. And I was also able to put into practice what I enjoy a lot, and that is design. So I went into designing the Singapore shawl. And the Singapore shawl supports the country, promotes the country, because we use the national flower, orchids of Singapore, plus the places of Singapore. And we also support the community, meaning I employ women to design and complete sewing the Singapore shawl. So A is to stay active. And so by doing all that, I can be active, you know. I was very active as a schoolgirl. I was swimming, inter-school swimmer. I was into sports and dancing and music. And so it wasn't difficult for me to stay active. And in fact, a great mood change for me is my music. You put on the music, you have the memories, and you also, because I did dancing, you know, I did ballet, I could just dance in my heart when I hear the music. Of course, when I'm at home and nobody's watching in public, you know, I could do my little jig at home too. So I am a happy person. And A is for attitude. What you can do, what you can use that God has given you to bless others. And so I'm grateful that I'm able to do that. Then we have C. C is to be connected. I am connected to my plants. I love nature. I grew up with the sea and the beach at Marine Parade. I stay connected to nature, with nature in my trees and in my plants. I do talk to my plants. I do tell them they're beautiful. I do tell them good night, you know, and I'm really very joyful just looking at my new banana leaf unfurling every day and every night. So that's me, staying connected, staying active. Yeah, C is for being connected to people too. I think we have to stay connected to people who are like-minded, who are happy people, who are good people, and they will keep us in a balance. So that's being connected. E will be for exercises. I do my ballet heel and toe and arm exercises at home in front of my mirror. Extending kindness is very important to me, to people who are around you, to people who are less fortunate than you in the community. And we see them all around, starting from the security guards to the gardener, you know, in the condominium. There are so many ways you can be kind to them. Cleaners. So that's my GRACE, aging with grace. So besides designing the Singapore shawl, I do landscaping, designing gardens, and I have won awards for that. As early as 1998, I won the Best Garden competition, and I used my interests to start community gardens. Here now, I'm at Mountbatten Vocational School. It has a special place in my heart because it's a school for special needs students. So here I do gardening, I teach them gardening. I have, of course, plans and hope to improve certification, accreditation that they can use for maybe jobs in gardening. in their lives. So I used to come here once a week because the timetable has gardening for them once a week. And I was here doing the landscaping and helping out for 1 year. And that gave me a lot of joy. Yeah. So GRACE, aging with grace. I think they have to find that inner bliss. What keeps them going? What is important to them? You can age beautifully. Of course, you have to care for yourself first of all. Care for yourself. Take care of yourself. Yeah? Look at the simplicity of life. Find out what you're happy in doing. Like I said, I would be happy having my health and a garden and music.
Thank you, Shelley. And so it's great to introduce Paul Irving. Paul has had a career as a corporate lawyer, but more recently has been very interested in aspects of population aging. He is the chairman of the Milken Institute Center for the Future of Aging. Prior to that, he was the Milken Institute's president, and he has many other roles, including an appointment at University of Southern California. That's something we share. He's the author of the book in 2014, The Upside of Aging. And I think that's a really important book because people like me were going around talking about aging as if it were a silver tsunami and all the bad things that might happen with an increase in the population above the age of 65. But I think one of the things that Paul got across to us was that that's not really the case, that there are many benefits from having older people in society, and we need to look at that and embrace that as we go forward. So what I've asked Paul to do to start is to just talk a few minutes about the Milken Institute and how it's approaching the issue of population aging. So Paul, thanks for being on the show.
Brian, it's great to be with you, and I have to say I miss my visits to Singapore. I always learn when I'm in Singapore, and Singapore is such a leading place for thinking about healthy longevity. So it's apropos that I'm speaking to you today, and that we're having this event hosted in Singapore.
Well,
so
if you do well tonight, we might invite you back, Paul. So.
Oh, good. Well, I look forward to it. So just very quickly about the Milken Institute Center for the Future of Aging. Our mission is to promote healthy and productive and purposeful aging, and we do that through a range of programs that involve applied research and convening and communication strategies and policy development, principally focused on the US, but I would say increasingly focused on other parts of the world where, frankly, oftentimes these issues are more advanced by public officials, academicians, business leaders, et cetera. And I think Singapore, again, is a great example of that. So that's really our focus. I would say, you mentioned earlier kind of this notion of moving from silver tsunami to golden opportunity. The reality is that this fast growing cohort of older adults is our fastest growing natural resource in the world. And we better either figure out, Brian, how we're going to capitalize on their wisdom and judgment and experience and ability to contribute to the next generation, or we will suffer the risks that people understand from a population that could be sicker, less engaged, and much more expensive, not only for societies but for families and institutions across those societies. So we think that this is a really, really important issue. And I often say that I think that addressing population aging in the 21st century may be the other issue, maybe one being the environment, being climate change, that really will define in many respects the future of life for people across the planet. So again, it's just an extraordinarily important and challenging both risk, but very much opportunity as well.
Maybe since you're right at the pulse of this, and maybe you can talk about one or two things you see happening that are really helping change this equation toward a golden opportunity.
Well, yes, and it's interesting in many ways. I know we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about COVID, but in many ways, one of the many frustrations associated with the COVID pandemic is, I think, it's set back a series of things that we're going to launch in 2020. The WHO's World Health Organization's Decade of Healthy Aging. The National Academy of Medicine in the United States, Brian, I think you know, had launched a major global healthy longevity initiative. So there are a series of things that kind of recognize that we're at a pivot point, that with the shifting population that, again, people, I think, very much recognize in Asia. We know that Japan is the first super age society, but in Korea and China and throughout the ASEAN countries, populations have grown much older, and frankly, average longevity in many of those countries longer than it is where I live in the United States. So we really are at this point where either we figure out new ways to keep people healthier longer and to empower them and enable them to have more, not just healthier lives, but more rewarding lives, to enable them to work longer and contribute longer, to reinforce the importance of intergenerational connection, to change policies and practices and hearts and minds about the potential of older adults. So I think all those things are incredibly timely. You know, I sometimes talk about what I describe as the longevity paradox. You know, Brian, you're a scientist, and all of us recognize the contributions that biologists have made, that geroscience is making to increasing lifespan and, frankly, increasing health span. But if you think about it, you know, you go back 150 years or so, and we have basically doubled average lifespans across the world. It's a miracle. I think in many ways the most miraculous thing that science has given us throughout history. So here we've achieved all these things as a result of advancements in sanitation and safety, and obviously medical science in many ways. These additional years, you know, in the United States, at the time Social Security was enacted, I think you know, average longevity was about between 61 and 62 years. We've added 20, 30 years to that calculus. So we have all this extra time that people like you have given us, and we really have no idea what to do with it. And I think that is the question that all of us have to answer. Government officials, those who run education systems, business people, those who create consumer products and technologies, and all of us in our own families. We have to figure out, how can we use this time more productively, in a more satisfying and happy and healthy way.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to come back to one thing you mentioned, these National Academy of Medicine Healthy Longevity grants. And I reviewed a lot of the US grants, and I was really impressed by a lot of the innovative ideas. And I think that's a great thing that's going on. We were also, our program here at the NUS was fortunate to get a number of those grants in Singapore. So we're actively participating in that. And that's really a global effort, not just something in the United States, as you know.
By the way, it's not only a global effort. Our last meeting, our last in-person meeting, I'm on the commission, was in Singapore, hosted by NUS, you might know, and of course John Wong of Singapore is one of the co-chairs of our commission. So Singapore is front and center on this issue, and again, no surprise, because Singapore has been kind of a hotbed of thinking and expertise on the issues that we're trying to address.
Let's come back to COVID-19 just for a bit, because we heard, if you watched the show last week, Matt Kaberlein talk about the fact that people over 65 have increased problems when they get COVID-19 and a much higher rate of mortality. But there are other issues for seniors with this COVID-19 pandemic that are important as well. And I wonder if you can just touch on a few of those.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, COVID has in many sad ways revealed a lot about what we need to think about in our health systems and in our health delivery. We know that it's not just age that's a risk factor, Brian, as you know. It's those who have multiple morbidities, comorbidities, and it really speaks to the question of health equity and access. Those who have healthy diets and who have exercise and who have meaningful work and educations are much less likely to have tragic outcomes than those who don't have those advantages. But there's a whole other, as you suggest, subset of problems that have arisen, principally as a result of our sheltering in place and our distancing. I don't really like to call it social distancing. I call it physical distancing, but it's distancing nonetheless. And that is really a dramatic increase in the sense of isolation and loneliness that older people in particular have a risk of. And that's why it's so important that we develop systems and approaches and practices that keep people connected even while they shelter in their homes. Ironically, this essential workers, those who work in physical labor and are required to be in places, are much more at risk, probably from the physical risks of COVID. But those who were at home have a different kind of risk, and that risk is the risk of being alone.
Yeah, and I think it reinforces this issue we have that all of these modern technologies are more inaccessible to seniors, and we need better strategies to encourage them to get more active in social media and other things that can compensate at least a little bit for the physical distancing.
Look, I'm more familiar, with the data and the circumstances in the United States, but a really substantial portion of Americans, a depressing portion of Americans, don't have access to the internet. It's not a public utility here. Don't have access to equipment. Of course, we're asking our kids to learn by distance learning, and of course, that one of the things that's just exploded in the world of health is telehealth. In the last year, something that was kind of being adopted very slowly before this, and has now become a norm. So, if you don't have access to broadband and you don't have access to a computer, you really are in many ways not just isolated from social connection, but you're unable to operate in the new environment of shopping online, of health online, of education online, of work online, and that runs the risk of widening the divides, exacerbating the disparities, elevating the inequities. Something we all have to think a lot about.
Yeah, I think it's a major challenge. Maybe we can transition a little bit from that to the idea of a longevity economy. And we talk a bit about the biotech sector and the emerging, longevity biology that's going on, which is exciting. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you call a longevity economy. And maybe you can talk about that a bit broadly, and then we can dig in a couple of areas.
Yeah, I think let's kind of take a step back and talk about what the longevity economy is. I think that the phrase was coined. It may have been coined at AARP in the United States. I think our mutual friend Joe Coughlin wrote a book on, who runs the MIT Age Lab, wrote a book on the longevity economy. But fundamentally, it's this notion of products and services and related innovations, and how they will affect economic growth, the workplace, and the impacts of shifting demography on economies across the world. And I think one of the things that we've come to recognize is a remarkable proportion currently of economic activity is driven by those certainly 50 plus and even those 60 plus, not just in the US, but around the world. I think in AARP's calculus, the US longevity economy, if it was a standalone country, would be third in the world by GDP, something north of $8 trillion. One of the major investment banks, I think, calculated that this year, the longevity economy globally would be about $15 trillion. So it's a very significant market, and not surprisingly. As you suggest, it kind of starts with health. That's the way people think about it. So they think about Brian, advances in biology, the prospects of longer lives, the prospects of healthier lives, digital health tools, new insurance products, new mobility devices, new social interventions that can address some of the issues that we just talked about relating to COVID. But it really extends way beyond that. It's financial services, obviously thinking about retirement in new ways. It's consumer products of all types. The myth is that for some reason older people stop consuming, and the answer is they don't. And they probably would even less than they do if designers and manufacturers and innovators thought about developing products that made sense for them. Living environments. I'll give you one example just of a potential opportunity. So in the U.S., something like, according to polling data, about 90% of Americans say that they want to age in place, which fundamentally means age in their own homes. Mm-hmm. About 5% of U.S. homes have the 5 most basic, this is according to the Harvard Center on Joint Housing Studies, have the 5 most basic universal design elements, things like levers instead of handles on doors, and flat shower entries and things like that. So in the U.S., it's probably true in Singapore too, but I suspect Singapore is well ahead of the U.S. on this front. Real estate across our society has to be dramatically adapted to a new demographic. And by the way, when we think about this new demographic, it's not just people getting older. It's not just extension of lives. It's historically low birth rates. So we have very few babies, babies not being born at replacement rate. Even in China, which of course has reversed the one-child policy in many respects, young people are having and desire to have fewer kids because they want to have a place to live, and they want to travel, and they want to experience all that the world has to offer, certainly post-COVID. I think Brian, that replacement rate, birth replacement rate is something around 2.1 per couple. That doesn't exist in much of the world today.
Yeah, it's very low here in Singapore.
Right. So if you kind of think of that fact, fewer and fewer young people as a result of low birth rates, more and more older people, changing demography that's very likely to continue, really absent dramatic policy intervention for decades to come. Any smart business person would look at that and say, that's an opportunity. That's the consumer market that I want to pursue, and some of them are getting it, but it's a bit slow. We're still in very early innings.
Holdups are. It seems like that transition is happening more slowly than you might expect.
I think it is. You are starting to see it. You're starting to see fashion designers think to themselves, well, gee, maybe there's a market for older fashions. Mm. There's a magazine in the United States, Allure magazine, that insisted that none of its advertisers use the words anti-aging in their ads, because they wanted to kind of celebrate the notion of aging, right? Women letting their hair grow gray, people accepting hairlines like I have, and not thinking that somehow that diminishes their capacity to do productive work. So we have to, this kind of notion of ageism, right? This negative age bias that in many ways infects societies around the world. Traditionally in Asian societies, this has been less an issue than in Western societies, but it's true even in Asian societies. As you know, this notion that somehow older people are less valuable, that they don't have roles to play, that they don't have a meaningful place in our society. Some of us internalize that and feel that way about ourselves. And it's something that we have to get over. And by getting over it, it's not just a soft concept. By getting over it, we will dramatically increase productivity, engagement, social connection, a whole series of other things that are good, not just for old people, but good for people across all ages.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast having moved to Asia for 3 years, because, growing up in the U.S., people as they get older, they're not going to let their kids tell them what to do. I mean, generally speaking. Whereas in Asia, you find that people, when they hit 70s and 80s, often the kids are making a lot of the decisions for them. And so it's an interesting contrast. And I think, one of the things, probably both sides could move a little more to the middle there. But one of the interesting things is to try to encourage people in Asia that if they're still healthy and they're still active, they still should be making their own decisions and living the life they want to live. And that kind of go ahead. I can let you address that. Then I'll go ahead.
Look, you have me at hello. I'm completely agreeing. When I go speak to audiences of older people, as I often try to do, just to make sure to check my own work, to make sure that what I'm saying and the research we're doing actually makes sense. I would say maybe if there's one word I hear from people consistently, by the way, regardless of class and race and religion and political belief and all, it's independence. You're right. People don't want to have the car keys taken away. They don't want their kids making decisions for them. They want to remain engaged and valuable and be respected. And look, the data on Alzheimer's and other dementias. In the U.S. It's similar in other parts of the world. About a third of people, 80 plus, have some form of dementia, cognitive loss. About 50% of those 85 plus. But I always say to people, if it's 50% at 85 plus, that means 50% don't.
Yeah.
Let's start talking about that group. And there are people who remain incredibly productive and perceptive, well into their 80s, into their 90s and beyond. And as we look toward 100-year lives, and Brian, I'm assuming you're going to continue to make progress in your work. We're counting on you not just to extend lives, but to extend healthy lives, most important. That notion of ensuring that we not only respect those additional years, but enable roles, valuable roles.
Yeah.
I think will just become.
Yeah, and I think that was coming to my question, which is, what do you do with all the retirement now? Right? It's how do we encourage people to stay active and empowered during those retirement years rather than sit at home and watch TV?
I guess I would start by saying I hate the word. I hate the word retirement. Look it up in the dictionary. You see descriptions like diminishment, withdrawal, loss of significance, disconnection, et cetera. I mean, unfortunately, in Spain they call it jubilation. Unfortunately, it's a hard word to change, and it tends to be a word that's employed around the world. But I think what's really important is we have to figure out a way to individuate it, in the same sense that now we think, in your world, there's a lot of conversation about personalized medicine, personalized aging. Our friend Hasi Cohen, who's the dean of the USC school, talks about personalized aging. We talk about precision medicine. Maybe we need to start talking about personalized retirement or precision retirement, because the reality is people have very different interests, aspirations, and capabilities during this latter part of life. I'm 68. I could be hit by a truck tomorrow and be gone, or I could be alive and kicking 20 years from now. I hope I am. I don't ever see myself retiring. Now, that could also just be by definition of retirement. I see change. Maybe I'll want to emphasize other things I already do. You mentioned that this is my encore career, but I think I'm not that much different than most other people who say to themselves, maybe I don't want to slog it out in that job that I've been doing for 30 or 40 years. Maybe I want to take up music, or I want to learn a new language, or I want to volunteer, or I want to work part-time, or I want to develop a new skill. But we have to embrace and enable that. Now, what does that require? It requires something that, by the way, I know Singapore happens to be a leader on, and that is a policy of lifelong learning that encourages and enables people to continue to refresh and reskill throughout their lives, to learn new things. And again, Singapore has been a leader on this, and I've actually invoked Singapore many times in Singapore's policy on lifelong learning on this side of the Pacific and on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the pond, where the same issues exist as well. It requires employers to think flexibly about workforces, new ways of working, work sharing, transitional retirements. Traditionally, in the US, and by the way, in much of Asia as well, people would work for a certain number of years. They would get a gold watch and a party and a warm handshake and a congratulation, and then they would fall off a cliff. I'm kind of doing a karate chop here to make the point. And there's no need at all for that. You lose their knowledge base. You lose that experience. You lose that perspective. Why not have extended transitional retirements where they can mentor successors, where they can bring their client and customer relationship skills to benefit? By the way, Brian, you know this. At one of the places that gets this right happens to be the American NIH.
Yeah.
The National Institutes of Health in the United States. It has a large group of older scientists who tend to mentor young investigators who are trying to figure out not only how to get their work done in their labs, but to figure out, the grant making and grant getting process, to figure out how to manage younger scientists in their own labs and all the rest. That's a wonderful model, and that model should be scaled and spread across all businesses.
If only we could get them to fund more research in the biology of aging. It'd be
we have.
I'll make that comment if you don't want to.
We have the TAME study, and we have some other
it's
things
moving in the right direction.
So it's I'm with you.
I mean, I think just to reinforce your point though earlier that, and by 2030 here, we're only having 2 workers for every retired person at the current rates. And so we have to figure out how to keep these people engaged as they get older. And do you imagine like sort of a broad scale retraining program for people that want to go in new directions or have to for some reason?
I think we have to do 2 things. One is, if there are any economists listening, please don't shoot me. So my friends who are economists oftentimes talk about the old age dependency ratio, which, Brian, tends to assume that everyone within a given society, a given cohort, begins to work at the same time and stops working at the same time. And those who are working are assumed to be productive, and those who are not working are assumed to be dependent. And we look at the dependency ratio and we say to ourselves, oh my God, the population's getting older. We're going to have a dependent, decrepit, useless population supported by an increasingly, apropos our comment on changing demography, an increasingly small group of productive young people. I say it's time for the dependency ratio to be blown up, to be reinvented. And again, I use myself as an example, and maybe it's not fair. I'm lucky. I get to work in a job that doesn't involve physical labor. But my point is, even for those who do work in jobs that involve physical labor, if we thought about them as a human capital resource, we thought about the things that they bring to that job that they may not be able to do anymore, how can we redeploy them for good? Yeah. Somebody who's been doing physical work all their life may be able to go into a classroom and give young people perspective, ideas, training in things that somebody who's done an academic career couldn't possibly convey. So I think we just have to think about, again, I'll use the word human capital. Yeah. In a very, very different way. And I used kind of this notion of, personalized longevity or personalized retirement advisedly. If we simply said to ourselves, look, our obligation as a society is to enable every person to realize their potential and to provide opportunities for people to contribute throughout their lifetimes. But if we just kind of started there, and then what we said is, what are the elements that get us there? The elements are health, nutrition, their education, their work opportunities, their intergenerational connection. Obviously, their social supports as well.
Yeah.
But I think we haven't made that decision yet, and I think we must. And again, I would say, I'm going to compliment Singapore again. I think Singapore happens to be one of maybe a dozen countries around the world where this is being talked about at the most senior policy levels, and I commend that. And we are not there in the United States yet, and we need to get there. And in some major European countries with rapidly aging populations, they're not there yet, and they need to get there. And if we do, we have the prospect of a generation, an era of flourishing. And if we don't, we'll have nobody to blame but ourselves for shrinking economies and lessened prospects. Not just for old people, but for young people as well.
One of the things that drives me crazy when it comes to entrepreneurship, especially you hear this from Silicon Valley, once you turn 40, you can't be innovative anymore. And I really think we should have entrepreneurship programs for people in their 50s and 60s and maybe even 70s, where they can have new ideas and start companies around that. And that may be a way to address this longevity economy sector issue that's so slow as well. If we have people that are experiencing that aspect of their lifetime, they may have a lot of unique ideas on how to develop strategies to deal with it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. So a couple of years ago, I was a participant in the White House Conference on Aging, which happens in the U.S. once every 10 years, and this was in the Obama administration. And there was a woman who spoke, who's absolutely fantastic, in her mid-90s, there's a famous design firm in the United States called IDEO. Brian, you might recall it from your days in the Bay Area, and they did design for a lot of the major tech companies. Very smart people connected to Stanford Design School and various other places. And they launched a program to think about design for older adults. And this woman, who had been a long retired engineer, picked up the phone and cold called their office and said, and these words became famous: "How can you design for us unless you design with us?" And that just couldn't be more true. Think about it even in terms of what we're dealing with COVID. So here we have clinical trials going on across the United States and the world, and oftentimes those clinical trials don't include the population most impacted, most at risk from the disease. Now there are reasons for that, having to do with consistency of the clinical trial cohort and all the rest. But the point is whether you're designing a new wheelchair or you're designing a fantastic new digital health app, or you're designing a new pair of jeans that's focused on this rapidly growing and resourceful older cohort, how do you do it without them in the room?
Yeah, I completely agree. And but that's still that's a broad component of all clinical trials. Most clinical trials focus on chronic diseases of aging, and they're hesitant to use people over a certain age. And again, there are reasons for that, but I think it's also kind of missing the point sometimes. So
I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Maybe Max, do you have some questions? I can bring Max Unfried, my PhD student, on board here to see if what the audience is thinking.
Hi, Max.
So the audience obviously has some questions for you guys. Like Xiaoping, who asked, should we retire at all if we are still healthy? If we should, what is the suitable retirement age as we live longer now?
You want me to tackle it, Brian?
Go ahead.
So there is correlation between work and health. And that's not surprising, because there's some evidence that people who have a stronger sense of meaning and purpose in their lives live longer. Becca Levy at Yale has done a really interesting research on this, having to do with self-image and aging, and those who have this sense of meaning and purpose in their lives have tended in her longitudinal studies to live longer. There's really interesting research at a Rush Medical Center in Chicago that says that people who have purpose in their lives have lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, and frankly, even slower development, not of some of the disease indicators, but of the manifestations of Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't cure plaques and tangles, but it may slow the development of the disease. So my argument is working is not just good for your wallet, it's good for your health as well. So obviously for some people it's possible and people should have choice. But I think for people who have the inclination to continue to work, it's a really, really good thing. And in terms of mandatory retirement ages, I've kind of made myself clear on that. While I believe very strongly in public supports, I think that there's a portion certainly of every population that needs and deserves both financial and health support later in life. And there are people who, as a result of nothing that they can be blamed for, either because they live in tough circumstances or because of health issues, are unable to work, and we need to support them. With that said, I think the notion of mandatory retirement is crazy. I think if somebody's being productive, that we should evaluate people based on who they are. The irony is, look, I got a prominent biologist on this session with me, and I assume he's the first person that would say chronological age these days should be absolutely meaningless. It should be meaningless. It's biological age that counts, and there are 40-year-olds who are sadly a wreck, and there are 80-year-olds who are vibrant and contributing and very healthy. So the notion of chronology as a basis to force people out of productive roles, to me, is just crazy.
Yeah, I've started to tell people that you have a chronologic age, but we need to do a recount, and we need to look at it from a biologic age perspective, because that's what really.
Having just gone through a presidential election here, as you know, we're mindful of the importance of recounts.
I'm sure. Give me just a little bit on retirement age. What's happening around the world, and where is it going up, and where is it stationary?
Look, I think in general, in Singapore and Japan and a variety of countries across Asia, traditional retirement ages are being extended. And I think that's generally the case in the U.S. and in Europe as well. But again, it's we haven't really figured out a way to navigate it. We don't align it well with pension schemes and with supports. We haven't figured out this notion of transitional retirement, shared roles, changing roles. There's some companies that are doing some interesting things on this front. There are some large companies in Europe that have come up with creative ways to engage their older employees, BMW and Michelin and various others. In the United States, there's a large company that has a snowbirds program that enables people, older employees who want to move from the cold north to the warmer south in the winter to continue their work in new areas. But I would say that they tend to be outliers. They tend to be very early. I'm a baseball fan. My team, I live in Los Angeles. My team just happened to win the World Series, so I can't avoid. Brian, you're a Bay Area guy. I can't avoid baseball analogies, but I would say for those who understand what I mean about this, we're in very early innings in the process of changing workforce norms and in changing employer ideas and practices. And this is one of the reasons why we need policy leaders. Mm-hmm. Not just those of us in the trenches, not people like Brian and I, but we need country leaders, people who run labor ministries, people who and very much people who run large companies to step up and say, we've figured out new ways to capitalize on experience.
Well, like as I'm sure professors, especially in the U.S., they tend to never retire. They just get found dead in their office at some point.
Right. Well, I've spoken in front of emeritus faculty groups and all the rest, and ironically, sometimes brilliant people, really brilliant people. I would give you one specific example of a conversation I had with somebody, and if I'm too specific, you'd figure it out. And I don't want you to do that. But this guy is a very, very prominent academic physician in the United States who really is a pioneer in an area recognized for doing one very specific procedure, which is now ubiquitous. And I remember somebody in his family saying to me, would you have a conversation with him, because he's not able to do this procedure anymore, number one, and number two, he's kind of moving to a point of traditional retirement, and he had nothing else in his life, nothing, and was finding it depressing, and so, you know, that's a message to all of us as we're aging. Max, this is a message to you. Develop hobbies. Don't just work for Brian and make sure that you're slaving away in the lab.
Don't worry, Max has plenty of hobbies.
So. Develop hobbies and interests and other things that engage you, because at some point in your life, those things may actually become the most important things you do.
Before you start thinking of hobbies, can you give us another question, Max?
Sure. Maybe with that respect, Kevin Miller has a question, which ties nicely to what you say about the hobbies. Like, is the 100-year life going to be happening and are millennials prepared for it?
Well, I probably ask Professor Kennedy what his view on that is. You know, I think there are some, Brian, I'm going to try to be really careful here. I think that there's some in the scientific community who are given to a bit of hyperbole about the prospects for radical life extension. It's certainly possible, but if you actually look at the progress of averages, it tends to be arithmetic, not geometric. I mean, look in the wake of the decoding of the human genome and the advancements of science and all the rest, explosive things are certainly possible, but we don't have to have explosive things to continue to make progress. You know, my own personal interest is less about more years. I think in the tape at the beginning, we heard this expression about not just longer lives, but better lives. So my real interest, I mean, if I had a call to action to Brian Kennedy, if Brian Kennedy could make me happy, what he would be doing is not just ensuring that lives are longer, but compressing mortality and morbidity, making sure that people stayed healthier in a more significant proportion of their life. Brian, you should.
You know that's what I want to do, Paul. So I'm going to try to do that then.
Okay, you're going to make me happy.
Making you happy is like way up on my priority.
That's good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No, actually, I was just pointing out that we'll have a lot of discussion around this next week, because have Aubrey de Grey, who's one of the more futurist-minded people in the aging field. And we've debated, Aubrey and I have debated this for a long time, and I actually like having people that think about the future, but my goals have always been to try to take biomedical interventions and validate that we can change the rate of aging, and more importantly, to increase health span. And we actually just published a paper, it's only in mice right now, but it shows a molecule that actually compresses morbidity. It only extends lifespan by about 10%. This is alpha-ketoglutarate, but it reduces frailty by 50%. And so we're hopeful that we can have positive outcomes in some clinical trials in humans now. But I think more and more of those types of interventions will be found. And the challenge is to validate that they work in humans, and to keep focused on what you just said, which is that it's about increasing the healthy years and maybe even compressing morbidity.
It's if it's possible, and again, thinking about societal stakes, back to this notion of longevity, economy, productivity, et cetera. Just imagine if we could narrow that gap between frailty and loss and death and extend those productive years. I mean, the economic potential again is powerful.
Yeah, Max.
Maybe with that, there's a question from Dimitri, and he wants to know, how does that impact finance? What kind of new insurance models are going to be needed?
What a great question. It's interesting because we're actually working on a project on that right now, having to do with long-term care insurance in the United States. So it's interesting if you think about two kinds. Well, I'll say, let me start this way. The good news about the insurance world, and two types of insurance really principally tend to touch this question of longevity. One is health insurance, private health insurance, and one is long-term care, health and long-term care, and life insurance. Health insurers and life insurers have interests that are perfectly aligned with my interests and with Brian's, and that is the longer they can keep people alive and the healthier they can keep people, the lower their costs are. They continue to benefit from premium payments, and they reduce the amount of payouts. So they have perfectly aligned interests with us. On the life side, it's interesting. The risk, which used to be death, is now more life. People used to buy life insurance because of the dramatic risk of premature death, and obviously they still do. But maybe the bigger risk today is people living too long and outliving their money. So new insurance products have to be developed that can provide long-term financial protection for those who may live 100-year lives, but may only have saved for 70 or 80 year lives. This is in the U.S. We have this conversation regularly because average longevity in the U.S. is around 80. It's around 76 for men, around 81 for women ish. But the truth of the matter is that's an average, which takes into account obviously mortality much earlier in life. And what that means is a lot of people are going to live into their 90s and are really financially ill-equipped. On the health insurance side, what excites me is the prospect of interventions that are focused on prevention and wellness. You know, in the U.S. we spend about 90% of our federal health budget on treatment and care, a little bit less than 5% on prevention and wellness, 5% or so on research and cure. Brian would like to see that number expanded dramatically. But I think the thing we know that can make a difference is investment at the front end. If we can keep people slimmer, I often say to people, I think the single most significant thing that's happened in public health in my country in my lifetime, maybe it was the polio vaccine, I'm not sure, but I think it's very likely progress on smoking cessation and tobacco control. Brian, maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. But
I would agree.
Imagine if we could tackle the obesity epidemic in the United States that very sadly we've exported to Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if we could dramatically reduce the rates of type 2 diabetes, improve cardiovascular health, improve pulmonary health. Imagine what that would have done in terms of COVID outcomes. So health insurers have the same interests. They want to keep people healthier longer, and we need to work with them to make sure that these interventions at the front end are expanded, grown creatively, and backed by evidence, backed by research.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are challenges too, though. I mean, I completely agree with you on the prevention side, and that's really what the aging field's trying to do, is to develop strategies to keep you healthy longer, which can be implemented much earlier. But while health insurance companies may be aligned with that, healthcare providers, particularly in some countries like the United States, are not. And I want to qualify this. I've had a lot of treatments in myself, and I've never met a doctor who didn't want to help me. But at the same time, they're often reimbursed based on procedures. Hospitals are looking at procedure rates. Pharmaceutical companies like drugs, they can charge a lot for to try to treat some disease, and prevention trials are expensive and they're hard to finance. And so we need to figure out ways to get other sectors of the healthcare economy on board with this, because it's really a challenge. And I think some countries that have more socialized medicine, I hate to use the socialized term, but where the government is financing the medical care, then it's an easier path to try to get more toward prevention and health.
I think you're right. And I would say, sadly, I think the U.S. has not only not been a leader, it's been a laggard on this front. And I think it's likely to continue to be. for just the reasons you suggest, Brian. So this is one of those things where we look to Singapore, we look to the countries across the Atlantic that tend to, I'll use the word as well, have more kind of commitment to socialized medicine and have an incentive to drive down cost and keep people healthier. It's really crazy that we don't in the U.S. I often say to people, the remarkable thing about the United States, and I may be saying something provocative here, but I still think that we have the best medical science in the world. We have an extraordinary research capacity in the U.S. We have remarkable medical schools. We have incredible research institutes, and our health outcomes are terrible.
Yeah,
terrible. And that's a product of a confused and I think in many ways illogical system of payment and reimbursement, and it's also a product of gross inequity in access. We have places in the United States where people get treatment that's just as good as the best treatment in Singapore or the best treatment in Norway or any place else in the world, and we have people who are getting health that is no better than the least effective health capabilities in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's kind of extraordinary.
And I'll say this: we have politicians that are now trying to take health insurance away from 20 million more people in the U.S. It's really just frightening.
We will see where the U.S. Supreme Court goes on that. I agree with it, and again, I think it's a failure of understanding of the importance of health. Max, that's why I appreciate the question about finance, because people have to not just think of health as health. Health is wealth. Health is economic growth. Health is productivity and innovation and national competitiveness. Sometimes I want to strangle my friends who are health economists, even though I tend to love economists, and I find oftentimes economists are the most compelling kind of arguers for change, because they're empirical, number one, and they do focus on economic impacts that are sometimes most compelling to people who don't maybe share my kind of social inclinations. But oftentimes they talk about things like disease care cost, and they limit their analysis to that instead of thinking about economic impacts, thinking about loss of productivity of disease sufferers, thinking about loss of productivity of caregivers. And when you start looking at those numbers, I mean, I can just use Alzheimer's disease in the United States as an example. I think the care cost last year number, Brian, you may know this number better than I, was somewhere in like the 290 billion dollar range, but fully loaded. If you take into account the economic costs, again, fully loaded, disease sufferers, caregivers, other losses in society, that number may be closer to $1 trillion. And it starts to make people understand the stakes in getting and keeping people healthier. One of our parties in the United States talks, sometimes they use the phrase American exceptionalism. Well, it's not a phrase I like, frankly, for lots of reasons, because I think the United States should be part of the community of nations and contribute and share generously. But if that's what you believe, that somehow America is exceptional, then the only possible way you can retain that or discuss it with any level of sincerity is if you make massive investment in improving American health, which is just not very good relative to peer countries around the world.
Unfortunately, American exceptionalism is becoming except for America.
Yeah,
World Health Organization, except for America. We have
these days. Sometimes when I'm giving talks overseas, I start with an apology, and maybe I should have done that here. But there are many of us who believe me, want to re-engage with not just friends in Asia, but friends in Europe and across the world. And I hope and believe that at some stage we will have leadership that's inclined to do that.
Great. Max, really quick, is there one burning issue?
We can have like one last question, which is maybe a little bit controversial. Daniel T asks, do we have data that supports from the mass population which suggests that people would want to live longer? Some may just want to live a healthy lifestyle with just a reasonable lifetime.
Brian, I don't, it's funny. I don't know of research that specifically addresses that. It's a great question, and I think an absolutely legitimate question. I mean, I think this is a question of free will and choice. The only thing I would say is, however long you want to live, whether it's 150 years or 80, I think everyone wants to live in a way that they are healthy, feel a sense of dignity and self-worth, that they're respected, their experience is valued. I think that's true regardless of one's inclination on that front.
Yeah, and I think the aging interventions are trying to keep you healthy longer, so that may be a bit of a false dichotomy anyway, that if we're successful, we're going to extend the healthy years. And I think most people want more healthy years.
I agree.
Paul, maybe we better stop now. Thanks a lot for participating in the discussion. It was great. I want to remind people that the chat is going to be open for people that want to continue to make comments. Next week, we have Aubrey DeGray from the SINS Foundation, who will tell us how we can live forever. And as last week, we want to close with a commentary on aging by someone, a famous person. And we started with a US president last week, so we're going to continue that theme and have the comments of another US president today. So thanks a lot for joining us, and remember to register for next week. Thanks again, Paul and Max. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Brian. Great being with you. Regards to all in Singapore.
Thanks.
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
I'm feeling like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down.